Hello, everybody, and welcome to Echo's first webinar of the year. I want to say thank you for everybody coming today. My name is Dave Zapponi. I'm the CEO of Echo, otherwise known as the Educational Council of Homeowners. I want to thank you for participating in our first community conversation. ADUs and JADUs in California HOAs. Echo is a 51-year-old statewide nonprofit association established to support HOA board members and engaged homeowners. Our mission is to foster a better quality of life in associations through education, advocacy, and connection. For today's event, we have a few housekeeping items. These are now presented on your screen. This slide was sent to all the registered attendees, so I'm not going to read through it. Please take a moment and review the housekeeping items. Today, we have a large audience, more than 200 people of HOA board members. We will do our best to answer your questions, but we may run out of time. Forgive us for that, please. We'll have, at the prerogative of the presenter, Jean, she will either take questions during the presentation or when she wants to, but we do have a scheduled Q&A session after the program. We will answer as many questions as possible. In addition to the live Q&A session, I will answer some questions via text in the Q&A feature during the presentation. To prioritize your questions, please use the upvote button in the Q&A feature. Those questions with the most upvotes will be answered first. It's easy, simple, and you just use the thumbs up. There's an icon there that's a little thumbs up, and just pick that one for the questions you would like answered. Those questions with the most thumbs up will be chosen first. Also, please keep your questions general in nature and short. We may pass over some questions if they're too complicated or if they are specific information that we just don't want to address for whatever reason. Specific questions about your community are best asked of your attorney or another appropriate expert in the field who's familiar with your situation. Please use the chat feature to report technical issues and to communicate directly with other participants in the webinar. We do not monitor the chat for the chat conversations for questions. Now, let me direct your attention to your monitor where you will find our disclaimer. None of what is said during this seminar shall be construed as specific legal or expert advice from the speakers, sponsors, or Echo. If you wish specific advice, we encourage you to contact your attorney or another suitable expert. The information we provide during this webinar is educational in nature and should not be relied upon for specific decision-making purposes. Thank you. This webinar and all of our events are made possible by the generous support of Echo HOA professional service providers. Please join me in thanking today's premier sponsor, Tailored Management Solutions, and our program sponsor, CID Consortium, LLC. Please support all Echo professional members and especially our sponsors. They make our education programming possible at little or no cost to you. We will now hear a brief word from Maria Hernandez with Tailored Property Management and from CID Consortium. Maria?
Hi, Dave. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. I was having some technical difficulties.
Okay.
Sorry about that. Alrighty. Good afternoon, and thanks everyone for joining Echo's Community Conversations. I'm Maria Hernandez, Senior Community Manager and founder at Tailored Management Solutions. I've been managing homeowners associations for nearly 2 decades. In this time, the community association industry has evolved plenty. So in recognizing this evolution, I realized the importance of keeping private firms in the industry, and so came Tailored Management Solutions. A little bit about Tailored Management Solutions. We're a private, full-service management firm serving communities throughout the Bay Area with our office located in Concord. Here at Tailored Management Solutions, we're committed to offering elite services with a tailored hands-on approach in management with a comprehensive and compassionate mindset for policy governance and asset management. We have a mission, and that's to provide personalized and professional services that optimize the well-being of homeowners and foster a thriving, harmonious community. We'd love to speak with you about your community needs. Please feel free to reach out for more information if you're looking for a private firm. That's info@tailoredmanagementsolutions.com. I hope you enjoy the community conversations today.
Thank you very much, Maria. Connery, I think you have a video from CID Consortium.
HOA board members are volunteers from a variety of backgrounds who face complex legal, financial, social, and maintenance challenges. CID Consortium LLC is proud to support educational opportunities for volunteer board members and HOA members. At CID Consortium, our purpose is to enhance your community living experience.
So thank you to both of our sponsors today. We appreciate everything you do for us. I'm looking forward to learning more about Tailored Property Management. It's a new firm and focused on sort of the elite members in the or HOAs in the community. CID not only manages HOAs, but they also help with financial issues. And Adam Haney is on our board of directors, and his dad is our benefactor member, and so he's a special. They're both special people for us. So now we'd like to introduce our speaker today. Gene Grove is a real estate attorney with nearly 20 years of experience in litigation and transactions. Gene represents homeowner associations, HOAs, real estate brokers and agents, developers, private lenders, property owners, and business owners. She focused her practice on real estate litigation and transactions, including common interest developments, HOAs, co-ownerships, TICs, and matters related to TICs, or tenants in common, purchase, sale transactions and disputes, and boundary, title, easement issues. She represents and advises clients on non-disclosure claims, co-ownership disputes, quiet title actions, partitions, boundaries and title disputes, construction development disputes, and leases. And when we were looking at this presentation and this topic to talk about today, both Connor and I said, who should we have? And we both said Gene. So Gene, we're excited to have you here. We know you are the person to go to on these matters, so please go ahead and take it away from here.
Thank you, Dave. Yes, I think just because of the spate of new laws that have gone into effect in the last 5 years, as a real estate attorney in this business, one must end up becoming an expert in this area, especially when it comes to ADUs and JADUs. And so that is what I will be focusing on today. Specific to HOAs. And I know a lot of you are probably interested in the most recent law that went into effect this year. I will definitely go into that and some takeaways from the law as we start the new year. So starting with our first slide, I'll want to just take a step back and give you a brief overview of where we are today and how we got here. Through the legislative background and history, starting about January 1st, 2017. That's when really the beginning of all of these new laws went into effect that effectively created more rights to create accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units. And I will get into what those are also momentarily. But basically, starting in 2017, we have AB 2299, which established ministerial review of ADU applications, which means unlike discretionary review, where local jurisdictions would be able to do all kinds of case-by-case analyses, ask specific questions about the project rather than a more rote procedure. AB 2299 really established the policy for the first time that more ministerial, meaning more rote procedures needed to be in place for ADU applications, which of course would mean much quicker turnaround times than typically had been happening up until that point. So that was a big change. And there's all kinds of legislative intent that you can read too, that really show us that the state was proactively thinking about housing, thinking about how to legislate to create more housing. And one of those areas was specific to creating more accessory dwelling units and JADUs as a matter of right. Fast forward to January 1st, 2020, we have AB 68. Also reiterates the requirement of ministerial approval rather than discretionary review for a wider range of ADUs and JADUs. One big one was removing owner occupancy requirements, but then at the same time, they also reinforced the limit on short-term rentals. And we see with subsequent laws that went into effect after AB 68, there is reiterating of limitations on short-term rentals. And it's a clear exception that's set forth throughout these laws that despite the policy of creating more housing and creating more ADUs and JADUs, there is always an express exception that local jurisdictions can limit short-term rentals. But basically, AB 68 was more of the same, requires ministerial approval rather than discretionary approval. Also that year was AB 670 that went into effect in 2020. And that was the big change to the Davis-Sterling Act, adding section 4751, which expressly states now that associations cannot unreasonably restrict the construction of an ADU. Now, of course, we can argue all day long as to what unreasonable is. As probably many of you know, you encounter that term in other contexts since that term is used in the Davis-Sterling Act elsewhere. Similarly here, associations really have to address this unreasonable question on a case-by-case basis. But know that, at least as far as the law states, the construction of an ADU cannot be unreasonably restricted, which means at minimum, there cannot be a wholesale prohibition on the construction of an ADU. And I think there was a question about that, somewhat related. Can a city approve an ADU without HOA approval? Not quite. So, and I'll get into that also because there are more laws that I'm about to address that specifically address what HOAs can and cannot do in this context. But the answer to that question, at least, is that it's actually the HOA that cannot unreasonably restrict the construction of an ADU, and that's under AB 670. So regardless of what the city may or may not say, as far as governing your particular association, you have to think about what your current governing documents say, and if it is tantamount to restricting the construction of an ADU in any way. And if so, there needs to be a reexamination of that language so you don't get into trouble if a homeowner tries to enforce this new law. The next portion of this slide, I don't know if I can see, but it is AB, there it is, AB, oh no, it's still in the same slide, last bill, AB 670, which also went into effect in 2020. Oh, and we addressed that, adding section 4751. So it must be the next slide, AB 3182. There we go. So I'm sure a lot of you, if you've been attending ECHO seminars, you've heard us talk about this law that went into effect later in 2020 and had all kinds of things in it. Rentals was a big one, and ADUs was the other big one. I'll get into it in future slides, but for purposes of this summary, just know that one of the many changes in AB 3182 was this 60-day window to apply for an ADU or JADU. Basically, if anyone were to submit an application to create one of these units, it's deemed approved upon submission of a completed application within 60 days. Again, thinking about the policy of forcing these local jurisdictions to get their act together and really move quickly on these applications. Next year, in 2021, we have AB 345, and that required the allowance of separate conveyance of these ADUs from the primary dwelling under certain circumstances. And those circumstances were, in a nutshell, if there was a recorded TIC agreement and a nonprofit corporation. And typically, as a practical matter, many TIC, tenancy in common, co-ownership arrangements are built around a nonprofit corporation. In other words, they're not a for-profit corporation that all own as investors. More often than not, they are homeowners who get into a written TIC agreement, and it has to be recorded. And for those folks, the law required that they be allowed to separately sell or convey those ADUs that they were allowed to build. So that was also a really big change. Next year, in 2023, just last year, we have AB 2221. And that requires local agencies who are reviewing these ADU applications to respond within 60 days. So again, a reiteration of back in 2020, AB 3182, we have this 60-day window and really requiring these local agencies to move quickly. It's reiterated here in 2023. And so there's a 60-day window once again, and that now applies to all the local departments, meaning planning, building, if there's any utility companies that come into play, all of them now are subject to this 60-day window. Obviously, the intent is to shorten the time for application review and processing. Another big change with AB 2221 was limiting the front setback requirements. So that means if there were historically a setback of so many feet from the street that you could build, that was also taken away to some degree by this law that went into effect in 2023. Also in 2023 was SB 897. There's quite a bit in there, a lot of duplication from the other laws that also went into effect the same year, with the intent of allowing more ADUs and allowing the streamlining of the application process. The biggest change that I saw in particularly 897 was changing the height limitations in certain circumstances. So the background was local agencies would often have minimum height restrictions as a condition for approving an ADU. So once again, the state weighed in and said, no, we're going to allow, again, more latitude to require local agencies to be more flexible with these height limitations. And then, of course, AB 1033 was the big one that went into effect this year. And it allows local agencies to adopt ordinances that allow the separate conveyance of an ADU from the primary residence as a condominium. And so I suspect that one is of much interest to all of you. I'll unpack it in future slides. But of course, this is a big change starting this year. So on the next slide, just going back to nuts and bolts, what is an ADU? What is a JADU? An ADU is a secondary dwelling, which provides complete independent living facilities on the same lot as a primary single-family residence. It can be attached to the main structure, or it can be detached, meaning a standalone structure on the same lot. It can also include a converted garage. By complete independent living facilities, it has to have at minimum its own kitchen and its own bathroom. A JADU, also known as junior accessory dwelling unit, is also an independent living area, but it doesn't require its own bathroom. So that's the big difference. And it has to be 500 square feet or more. But that's pretty small, as you can imagine. And it doesn't have to have its own bathroom. So of course, bathroom isn't included in that 500 square feet, or it doesn't have to be. But it has to be an independent unit in its own sense, but for the bathroom, meaning its own separate entrance and a kitchen. And I use quotes for kitchen because that's a really flexible term. a kitchen for a JADU can be really one of those plug-in appliances, those kind of stove top heating appliances. So it doesn't have to be a full-blown stove that you need gas for. It really can just be something as simple as a converted existing bedroom, as long as it has access to a bathroom within the structure. And next slide. So Senate Bill 9 was another big bill that went into effect in recent years. And it's not so much pertaining to ADU, but it's definitely related in that it promoted this policy of more more housing, and definitely recognizing that 95% of California's population is in an urbanized area or urban cluster. And so with all of those policies in mind, the Senate enacted Senate Bill 9 and said large lots, meaning at least 2,400 square feet or more, are eligible to split their lots, period, the end, and build a duplex. So how it pertains to ADUs, just parsing this out a little bit, as you can imagine, if you have two lots, and now we have all of these laws that allow us to build these ADUs, and JADUs, you could theoretically lot split into two different parcels, and within those two parcels create multiple ADUs and JADUs. So it really is creating more and more units in keeping with this policy of creating more housing within existing lots. So SB 9 said a house that has been occupied by a tenant in the last 3 years cannot be altered or demolished in order to do the lot split. So that is a clear exception. There's also clear exceptions for properties in specific zones. Some examples I listed here were very high fire hazard severity zones, earthquake fault zones, floodplains, anything in a historic or landmark district. And over the years, local governments were already attempting to exempt themselves from SB 9. So in my final bullet point here, local governments were also allowed to use a health and safety or physical environment exception. And so that's where local governments were really trying to come up with regulations that would allow them to say there's a physical environment exception or a health and safety exception, so that they would not be subject to SB 9 and be forced to split these lots. And the state has, over the years, really hammered down on these attempts by local governments. There's a story that went viral in Marin County, where a small town in that county attempted to claim there was a physical environment exception, and they tried to enact a protection of some type of wildlife. And the state said, nope, that's not considered a protected wildlife species. We call that this is a completely manufactured basis, and overturn that. So it's hard to say right now what is going to classify under these exceptions for health and safety or physical environment, as opposed to, for example, very high fire hazard severity zones. There are maps that really show us all of those zones, earthquake fault zone and all of that. That's less subject to dispute. But so far, I'm not aware of local governments successfully applying an exemption under physical environment. Next slide. Senate Bill 10 also went into effect at the same time as Senate Bill 9, and it's more on zoning. So as SB 9 applied to lot splits and the physical division of properties, Senate Bill 10 was intended to expand the zoning requirements for properties like this. So it allows cities to rezone areas for up to 10 unit buildings in a streamlined way, meaning without CEQA review. Some of you know that CEQA can be a death knell for developments, and it stands for California Environmental Quality Act. And so removing by law the need for CEQA review was a big deal. And that's one of the main takeaways of Senate Bill 10 for areas with up to 10 unit buildings at least. Residential properties that are affected are basically the ones that are in transit-rich areas and urban infill sites. So you're thinking metropolitan cities that have access to public transportation, et cetera. And then it also allowed cities to pass ordinances that allow for this type of development. But unlike SB 9, this is a big difference between the two bills. This state law, SB 10, does not require cities to adopt this type of development. So that was an interesting shift between the two. SB 9 requires cities to allow lot splits for 2,400 square feet lots or more. Here, this is just cities may adopt this rezoning right. Next slide. So I'm going to switch over to AB 3182. And just a short blurb on rentals. I know we're mostly focused on ADUs, but it is relevant in the sense that if one is thinking about renting the ADUs or JADUs that they are creating, it's also important to know these restrictions on rentals. So as I mentioned before, short-term rentals are absolutely prohibited, and AB 3182 expressly states that now. And you'll see in the whole history of these pro-ADU laws, they reiterate local jurisdiction ability to limit short-term rentals. So that's pretty clear. It also, in AB 3182, put rental or restricted rental caps, rather, of 25% or less, meaning that associations cannot have rental caps of less than 25% in their governing documents. And then there's an express requirement to amend the governing documents if it is not in compliance with this new law. And then as it applies to ADUs and JADUs, at least under AB 3182, owner-occupied units do not apply to the cap. So that could mean that an owner who has the right in an association to create an ADU could rent out the ADU, and it doesn't count against that rental cap if there's a rental cap in the association. Next slide. A little bit more about AB 3182 as it pertains to ADUs specifically. As I mentioned earlier, there's a 60-day limit to approve or deny a permit for ADU construction. And remember, it's deemed approved if there's no response from the local agency. Existing ordinances governing the creation of an ADU shall provide an approval process that includes only ministerial provisions for the approval of ADUs. So I know there was a lot of attention paid to the rental cap and rental restrictions in general with AB 3182, but I feel like there wasn't as much attention paid to the ADU rules. They were pretty drastic in my view, in that they really took away all the power from local jurisdictions to say anything about yes or no on an ADU. And this is just one of many examples. That ministerial versus discretionary review change is a big deal. This law expressly states local governments cannot have any kind of discretionary processes or provisions. There were also standards set forth in this bill for how to evaluate an ADU application. So in other words, there are no additional standards that can be used or imposed. That also includes an owner-occupant requirement, which was also a big change. And then, of course, once again, this law reiterated that local governments can once again still limit short-term rentals, or in general can regulate short-term rentals. Next slide. A little more about AB 3182. It also prevents cities from setting minimum and maximum square footage requirements that would have the effect of preventing usage of ADUs. The law also said local governments cannot prohibit efficiency units and must allow for no less than 850 square feet. It also prevents cities from imposing parking standards for an ADU. And it restricts charging fees or capacity charges for utilities when an ADU is built. Now, I'll mention here, the law is addressing local jurisdictions, local governments, right? And so I often get a question about how this pertains to associations, who of course will be seeing an increased usage of utilities within their association if there's more and more ADUs constructed within the project. And the answer to that is, well, one, it's arguably not clear based on how this law is written, but in order to harmonize these laws, especially with recent laws that went into effect after AB 3182, it's rational to assume that associations can reasonably regulate things like increase usage of utilities, et cetera, as they are transitioning to additional units, effectively, additional ADUs that may be in the project. So take a look at the law, and I'm happy to address more specifics offline. But in general, if you're confused about this bullet point, not being able to charge extra fees or capacity charges for utilities, the way I read it is it really only applies to the local governments who are reviewing the ADU applications, not associations. Another important point is that this particular bill, AB 3182, at least the parts of it that relate to ADUs, actually sunsets on January 1st of next year. So we'll see. I'm sure the legislature will be busy this fall once again. So we'll probably have news on that front. And keep in mind, that's only the ADU related laws. So the rental restriction piece presumably will stay in effect even after this sunsets, if it does. Okay, before I move on, because now I will be talking about the promised AB 1033, let me take a look at some questions. Does the city, and I'll skip around because I see some 1033 questions already, which I'll save for later. There's a question about whether the city has discretion to define what a kitchen is. It depends on, well, I don't think they have the right to define what a kitchen is. They will have the right to determine what's considered safe versus not. So if there's a need to create so many electrical outlets, for example, and if that prevents the use of a plug-in appliance to make it a kitchen for an JADU, that might be a case-by-case basis. But to have wholesale definitions of what a kitchen is versus not is definitely not going to have the effect of denying an ADU or JADU application. Parameters of an earthquake zone, they are set forth in some state agency website, similar to the wildfire severity zones. I don't have those websites offhand, but they are California state agency websites, and you can look up on the map. I think they are interactive too, and you can determine within a few minutes, if you play around with these websites, to determine if your property in question falls within an earthquake zone or a wildfire zone or a floodplain. Another option is to ask your city, depending on how they organize the particular city, someone should have that information at the ready, because as you can imagine, they're also facing these same questions as they're processing ADU applications. So there are various sources to determine that. Can the HOA fees be increased if ADU unit is added to a unit? Well, presumably yes, but always remember that it cannot be tantamount to an unreasonable restriction of the ADU. And so it can't be, for example, operating as a penalty that, oh, because you got to get an ADU, your assessments are going to be automatically triple. There has to be some rational basis to increasing the assessments. And sure, if it's due to an increased usage in utilities, as I mentioned earlier, in my view, AB 3182 was not attempting to restrict that. And that is something that the HOA in its purview can even amend its governing documents to account for that. Any increased usage in utilities will result in increased assessments. So assuming proper procedures for raising assessments in that circumstance, then yes, I think you can increase due to an ADU. If someone converts their garage to a JADU, do they have to install a window? I don't know about windows, and I think the government code is silent on that. It might have to do with fire safety type questions, which I certainly am not an expert in that regard. And I think it would also depend on the particular property and the city. So there isn't a black and white answer to window or no window for ADUs or JADUs. The key is separate entrance for an ADU and a JADU. And then for an ADU, it has to have its own bathroom and kitchen. Let's see. Can a condo owner located in an end unit add an ADU that would sit on common area? So no, the presumption is creating an ADU within an owner's current lot. So all of these ADU laws, especially as they pertain to HOAs, don't have the effect of taking other parties' properties. And this would be taking another party's property. It would be the association's property because they own the common area, and all the members actually own it jointly. So no, if it had the effect of encroaching onto common area, that would be a basis, a reasonable basis to say no to the ADU request. Can an owner of a condo construct an ADU in their carport? That's an interesting question. Assuming the carport is exclusive use common area, I think there is a decent question whether they can do that. Again, without getting into specifics about life safety, fire hazard, anything like that, just conceptually, if the carport is owned by that condo owner as exclusive use rights, I think theoretically it could be constructed as an ADU or JADU. If an owner has limited space on a lot, can an ADU be added as second story, such as over the garage? Well, regardless of reason, if that second story over the garage belongs to the owner, then yes, I think that's actually a fairly common type of ADU or JADU. So, and you wouldn't necessarily have to establish limited space on a lot. That I think theoretically you could just apply for that second story over the garage. And again, assuming there are proper zoning requirements in place and it passes muster from a planning, building perspective, et cetera, conceptually that should be allowed to be on the second story. Let's see. I think I covered everything. So I'll move on to 1033. Assembly Bill 1033 went into effect this year. It is codified in government code sections 75852.2 and 75852.25. And it essentially authorizes a local agency to adopt a local ordinance to allow the separate conveyance of the primary dwelling unit and accessory dwelling unit, ADU, as condos. It must be adopted by the local municipality, the local government. So this is not automatic. Even though AB 1033 went into effect January 1st of this year, there is no local government, to my knowledge, that has managed to make this into law in the last 17, 18 days. So it's not as if this is already law. The way that the current bill reads, it is allowing local agencies to adopt local ordinances to do this. So unless and until your local jurisdiction enacts an ordinance that says you can separately convey the ADU as a condo, unless it does that, there is no current law in place for your property. So that's an important prerequisite to understand. But don't get me wrong, this is a really big deal. So if you remember, when I was going through the history of pro ADU laws over the last few years, it was, let's see, I think it was AB 345 that went into effect in 2021. And back then it allowed the separate conveyance of ADUs under fairly limited circumstances. And in effect that it only applied to TIC, tenancy in common owners with a recorded TIC agreement And obviously they also had to be a nonprofit organization. So it was a pretty narrow application, but of course, it started this trend of allowing the separate conveyance of ADUs. So now, as of this year, local jurisdictions can now enact ordinances that allow the separate conveyance of ADUs as condos. So once again, 1033 reiterates that local governments can continue to limit short-term rentals. So that's there in case anybody had any questions about that. But then it also says associations that are created under the Davis-Sterling Act have to develop new regulations, new CC&Rs that allow for this separate conveyance of ADUs. So the order of business has to be that you have to wait until the local jurisdiction enacts this as law, and then you can amend your CC&Rs accordingly. But it would be arguably premature to account for this until the new law for your particular jurisdiction goes into place. But it is important to note, and it certainly doesn't preclude associations from thinking forward and thinking, how would we amend our CC&Rs to account for this expected new law, and make sure you're ready ahead of time so that you can capture that as soon as possible. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you amend your CC&Rs right now without even knowing how the local ordinance will read. So a little bit more on 1033, the last few bullet points on this slide. It removes, as I said earlier, the prior restraint on selling the ADUs separate from the primary residence, other than AB 345 that went into effect in 2021. There really wasn't any other ability until now to do that. And then it also removes the owner occupancy requirement of either the primary residence or the ADU. So that's also a big change. I think arguably the bigger change in 1033, because that is in effect right now and since January 1st of this year. No more owner occupancy requirement for either unit. Next slide. Other new changes that 1033 brought on, local agency, this is a little more of the same, may also adopt a local ordinance to allow the separate conveyance of the primary as well as the ADU as condos, and the condos shall be created pursuant to the Davis-Sterling Act, and also need to be in conformance with the Subdivision Map Act. So those are the two key takeaways of 1033 as they pertain to associations. If and when a local jurisdiction enacts a local ordinance, they will have to at least comply with these two conditions of 1033. And whether they state it expressly or not, it doesn't matter. 1033 under the government code will state this. So this is where associations want to think ahead and think, assuming these new ADUs are going to be sold, assuming they're going to be subject to our governing documents and also the Davis-Sterling Act, how are they fitting into all of this? And I have a slide in a couple of moments where I have some best practices tips. But that's really the most important thing about 1033 is that these condos, new ADU condos are going to be created pursuant to the Davis-Sterling Act and the Subdivision Map Act. And then there's actually a couple of other important points there. My last two bullet points. Before the condo map is recorded that shows these new ADUs that have been constructed, there must be a safety check of the ADU, and it obviously has to have its own certificate of occupancy. So that's where the local government and its various agencies will weigh in. So those are all prerequisites to recording the condo map. And that piece is actually not very different from a typical subdivision of just regular non-ADU units. Definitely a prerequisite is obtaining that certificate of occupancy before you can actually create your project, your condominium project. So now this law simply says it applies to the ADUs. And also that lender consent is required before anything can be recorded, meaning the lender of these particular units has to sign off and consent in writing before any of this can happen. So in theory, If a local government were to create an ordinance in compliance with AB 1033, and in theory, if the association matches that law and says, here's what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to regulate or not the sale of this ADU, arguably, the last prerequisite is, does the lender consent? And we don't know how lenders are weighing in on this new law. And so if that key prerequisite doesn't actually get checked off, then the sale of that ADU can't happen. So if you're one of the folks who are thinking about creating an ADU, I would definitely recommend checking in with the lender on the early side, because that will be a piece that you may not be able to control, maybe even worse than having to go through the whole process of an application with the local government. Okay, next slide. So let's see, a little more on 1033, which are all set forth in the bill itself. If an ADU is established as a condo, the local government shall require the homeowner to notify the providers of utilities like water, sewer, gas, electricity of the condominium creation and separate conveyance. Query how this will be enforced, but in any event, it's there. And so the burden is on that homeowner who has the ADU to notify all of those utility service providers of that new condominium. And then, of course, of the sale, if the sale goes forward. The owner of a property or separate interest within a planned development, such as an existing association, shall not record the condo plan to create this common interest development without the express written authorization of the existing association. I put this in bold because I have already been getting a lot of questions about, well, can an owner just go rogue, somehow fast forward an ADU because they've got a streamlined process with the city now and completely violate our existing CC&Rs? And the answer is no. The law also weighs in on this expressly. You have to get the association's approval. So, but remember, association cannot unreasonably restrict. So it's not like you can just give them a wholesale no. But if that owner has created an ADU, presumably in violation of the alteration restrictions of your CC&Rs, it's still a plain vanilla enforcement action. And all of these laws don't immunize that owner from complying with the governing documents. And then here's a little more about what written authorization looks like. It means approval by the board, has to be a duly noticed board meeting, has to be pursuant to the governing documents, membership approval, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, the ADU, it's just reiterating that the sale of the ADU or otherwise conveying the ADU separate from the primary residence has to satisfy all of these conditions outlined in the paragraph. So taking this a step further, if a homeowner were to go rogue, create an ADU that's actually approved by the city, but in violation of the existing CC&Rs, and then go so far as to sell that ADU, all without the approval of the HOA, that would likely be an invalid sale at the outset because of the language of this law that says this is only valid, that conveyance is only valid if you follow these conditions. One of those conditions being express written authorization of the association. All right, next slide. Relevance to HOAs. As promised, I summed up just some takeaways or things for boards to think about in the wake of this new law. Obviously, any of these ADUs have to be subject to the governing documents and also resulting assessments. So just think about how that applies to your particular project. And especially when it comes to location of ADUs, if you're thinking there's the possibility that everyone's going to create an ADU in their carport, how is that going to affect parking? Remember that there are general policies in these recent laws that say at least local governments cannot condition ADUs based on a certain number of parking spots. And remember, the law also says that associations cannot unreasonably restrict the construction of ADUs. So it's always about what can be rationally tied to a particular rule or regulation that the association may want to implement if and when an ADU is created. Also think about occupancy, rentals, of course. Think about AB 3182 and how that applies when it comes to these ADUs. There's a whole host of things to think about as you're re-examining your governing documents. The other piece that I mentioned, the lien holder, I can't stress enough that this is actually kind of the trap that everyone might end up encountering, because we just don't know how banks are responding to this law. And it is an express prerequisite to the sale or conveyance of a condo. So even if all the laws are pro ADU, even if all the associations are effectively pro ADU, the final say might end up being that lien holder. So don't forget that piece. Let's see. And I think I already summed up a lot of these things. This second to last bullet point about the local agency, they have to actually provide notice to applicants of the AB 1033 requirements. So it's just another burden on local governments to help, once again, streamline this process. And then, as I mentioned, the homeowner has the burden of providing utility service providers of the condo creation, the fact that their ADU is now condo, and then also if it's sold or otherwise conveyed. Okay, I'm going to return to some questions here now. How does AB 1033 affect association assessment per lot? I think I addressed that already. Basically, it will have an effect. There's no question about it, especially as it affects utility usage and occupancy, potentially parking and traffic and all of those things. So no question it will have an effect. It's just a question of to what extent an association can reasonably regulate that. And my position is that reasonable assessment increases that are directly tied to an ADU and the resulting increased usage of certain facilities and things like that, those are all certainly reasonable and within the purview of the association. Can an HOA that is not subject to Davis-Sterling prevent separate conveyances? So I'm not aware of a common interest development in California that would not be subject to at least the commercial Common Interest Development Act or the Davis-Sterling, which pertains to residential. So if the question is a property that doesn't have common area, like a single family home, in a single family home context, of course, you could create an ADU and even a JADU. And actually, AB 1033 would say that you can separately convey that ADU and JADU now. So that would be in a single family home, one parcel. And presumably you would have to now sell it as its own little CID. And so you might have to create governing documents for that purpose. So it might not have been originally subject to the Davis-Sterling Act, but by separately selling that ADU, you will then be subject to the Davis-Sterling Act, and therefore you have to comply with all of its prerequisites, including, of course, CC&Rs and condo map in general, governing documents for that little project. Let me see. Are city zones residential to be up to 30 feet in height, i.e. 2-story, while our CC&Rs limit mostly to single story? The city has limited ADU height to 16 feet, and we are not within a half mile of transit. So is this enforceable so long as there is space for the ADU? If there is not space on the lot, could the owner override the city and build a second story? Okay, so let me unpack this a little bit. First of all, one thing I forgot to mention when I said one of those laws adjust or at least increased the ability to or gave more latitude to height limit restrictions, that precondition is you have to be a half mile away from transit. Trying to find that law that I mentioned, SB 897, which went into effect last year. So just a reminder, that law said local governments cannot be so stringent on height requirements, but that's only if the property is within a half-mile of transit. So this question is about CCNRs that limit mostly to single-story, even though the city is zoned for two-story. And, oops, I lost it. And then if an ADU is built there, I guess the question is if the CCNRs are still enforceable, or can the owner override and build a second story? I think the way you need to reconcile it is, first, is the city approving the ADU for whatever reason, right? Whether it's they have to because the height has to be adjusted, max height has to be lowered, or whatever it is. And then the next question is whether it's compliant with the CCNRs. And remember, the CCNRs should not and cannot be inconsistent with the local ordinance. So I hope that answers the question. If the ADU was otherwise approved by the city, the CCNRs cannot implement additional requirements to effectively prevent the construction of the ADU. Let's see. If the ADU is sold as a condo, will the new condo owner be responsible for paying assessments? The answer is yes, and that's confirmed in AB 1033. Can we limit the amount of people living in an ADU? Theoretically, yes. Remember, there's no owner occupancy requirement, but as far as occupancy in general, yes. Once again, would be subject to local laws as far as fire safety, hazard, and egress, and things like that. But there would be ultimately a max occupancy in place, just as there is theoretically for the pre-existing condominium or the project altogether. Let's see what else. Board may approve ADU subject to member vote, making ADU owner pay separate assessment, and the owners do not pass such assessment. Is this unreasonable denial? If the owners do not pass an assessment to make the ADU owner pay, I don't see how that would be an unreasonable denial, but that would be allowing the new ADU owner a lot of latitude if they're not required to pay an assessment. So I'm not sure if I'm reading that right. If it's the opposite and the owners effectively vote against the permission of an ADU, or somehow put extra restrictions on a new ADU owner, yes, I think that would be tantamount to an unreasonable restriction, and would likely be unenforceable, even if the owners were to pass something like that. Does AB 3182 override existing square footage limitations for ADUs? For instance, Sac County currently has a limit of 1,200 square feet. Yes. So JADUs again are 500 square feet, I believe. So yes, if the current county that you're in has a current limit, maybe that's for the primary residence as opposed to the ADU. So that might be the reason why Sac County has 1,200 square feet rule. But in any event, yes, all of these new laws now establish much smaller square footage, especially for JADUs. Okay, lender consent. What if the ADU is paid for with cash? Very good question. The answer is you don't need that prerequisite anymore. So that is absolutely a way that you can sell these condos and not have to worry about that prerequisite. Now, of course, this is assuming local ordinance has been established, the CCNRs have been amended, and now allow for a process at least for approving the ADU and the sale of the ADU. And as long as those processes are not unreasonable, et cetera, et cetera. So assuming all those other conditions in AB 1033 are satisfied, then sure, the ADU could be sold for sale. Sorry, for cash, for all cash. Does an HOA board have a right to not provide written authorization if the property owner follows all the required state regulations? So I touched on this a little bit, and the answer is no. AB 1033 really shows two discrete separate conditions. One of them being for sure the city process, which we now know is effectively ministerial for most places. But that is a process you still have to nonetheless follow with the local jurisdiction. But then separate and discrete from that is HOA written approval. And that's pretty clear in the law. So no, you couldn't have just one and allow an owner to follow all the city rules and not still also follow the HOA rules. Can an ADU or JADU be converted back at any point? I don't know the answer to that. All of these laws have been really focused on how do we create more units? How do we create housing? I think it is, I mean, based on my reading of all of the legislative intent of all these new laws in the last 5-6 years, I would actually say it's against public policy to effectively merge these units that have been created. But again, I don't know if that's a wholesale answer for every property. Perhaps if there were particular circumstances that required two lots to be merged back together. I don't know if that would be expressly prohibited under these new laws, but definitely they're not addressed in recent pro-ADU laws. Wouldn't a private conveyance of an ADU be considered subdevelopment of a piece of property? Our CC&Rs forbid subdevelopment of a lot. Perhaps, and I would have to read the particular CC&Rs, but it sounds to me like those would have to be updated in light of 1033. Can you describe more about any restrictions or requirements that ADUs and JADUs be within 1/2 mile of public transit or not? I was referring to SB 897, which went into effect January 1st of last year. I don't have the full text, but definitely look that up, and that's where that precondition applies. Can you stop renting an ADU or JADU or use it for family instead of rent, like an aging grandparent? So this delves into more rental restrictions, which I can touch on briefly. My office does quite a bit of rent control type of work. But in a nutshell, as you remember, AB 3182 has the express prohibition on short-term rentals. So assuming that's not the case here, and you're just talking about a tenant-occupied ADU or JADU, then you have to determine whether you have a local or state rent control provision that applies to that unit. And if you do, then you have to follow all of those rules before you can recover possession or even increase the rent for that particular unit. Whether or not it's an aging grandparent or a family member, it's hard to answer that generally. The first question is whether it's subject, whether that unit is even subject to any kind of local or state rent control law. Okay, so I have a couple more slides, mostly some takeaways on 1033. I think I touched on this, but I'll just reiterate that, you know, I definitely don't want to instill fear with this law. And I think there was understandably a lot of consternation around it when people started learning that this law went into effect. And I'm not really sure how the media has been reporting on it, but I just mostly want to emphasize that this has not happened overnight. Nothing to my knowledge has actually changed in the last 17 days since the law went into effect. Yes, this law went into effect, but the important thing to remember is it is allowing local jurisdictions to implement local ordinances, and the key is may. So we'll see what these various jurisdictions do, but it's definitely not happening overnight. And like I said, I think it would be premature to amend your CC&Rs now without even knowing what your local ordinance will say, if it says anything. But definitely it's worth thinking about and how you might respond. but definitely too early to go about amending your CC&Rs now. As I also mentioned, let's see how lenders will respond. I wasn't really closely following any of their lobbyists leading up to this bill, whereas the California Association of Realtors were pretty vocal against this bill for a lot of reasons, including the lender response. So I don't know how that will play out. And as one person mentioned correctly, if it's an all-cash deal, who cares? But at least for those that are tied up with security, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. One thought, of course, is these ADUs may reduce the equity in the property, and how's the lender going to respond to that? Does it decrease the value of the original security? So we'll see how that plays out in the coming year. HOAs should definitely think about budgeting purposes, best practices, how they're going to restate their governing documents so that they're ready for if and when the local ordinance changes. But as I mentioned, right now it's so new that it's hard to even predict which cities will actually implement this new law. And then final slide, how do ADUs impact HOAs in general? So property values could increase or decrease. I think that also remains to be seen. And assessments, I think for sure, will need to increase due to additional usage. Occupancy will presumably also increase in general. Density within the community will be much higher. So these are things boards need to think about. Parking would be heavily impacted. In the example of the carport, if that's removing all parking spots, that's going to have an even greater impact with more people and essentially no more parking spots or a highly reduced number of them. So that's going to be a big one. I would actually recommend that those who are anticipating some major parking problems, that you consider adopting a parking permit system fairly soon. And then the architectural concerns, I mean, those could go on and on. Obviously, an association needs to start thinking about architectural guidelines specific to these ADUs and JADUs. Remember that ADUs can include, I don't know if I mentioned this, but anyway, ADUs can include prefab units. And so how is that going to clash potentially with the architectural design of the community, especially those that are visible from the street? Remember, there's no more front setback requirements. So these ADUs could be right front and center, maybe even in front of the primary residence. So that's a big thing to think about. Privacy concerns. I think there was actually a question about that. But yes, it's definitely a question whether an association can regulate an ADU to minimize any invasion of privacy of other members. The location of windows and doors in relation to neighbors is going to be really important to consider, depending on the configuration of your project. Even guidelines around external doors required for JADUs. So again, depending on what's being built, is the external door going to have to match the current design and guidelines that the architectural committee currently has in place, or are they going to have to amend that to reasonably allow these JADUs and ADUs to be created? And then just remember that all of these units have to comply with local zoning ordinances and applicable building codes, and those vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and from property to property sometimes, depending on the age and configuration of the house or the property. So lots of things for HOAs definitely to think about. I'm definitely weighing in with certain boards who are kind of thinking ahead in the coming year, where on the one hand, I'm telling them nothing to actually do right now, but definitely start having some preliminary meetings, maybe even create a committee or have your existing architectural committee start thinking about how they're going to modify their guidelines. And I think it's not even a question of if there's going to be some amendment needed to the governing documents. It's more a question of when and how. So definitely worth thinking about, but nothing to panic about either. So with that, let me see if there are any more questions.
We're ready to go. Okay, thank you, Jean. We appreciate your interesting and insightful look at ADUs and junior accessory dwelling units. It's a bit of a challenge for everybody, and I think we put these in place very quickly in California in order to have more housing made available, especially in urban areas. So it's a very interesting and very troubling a problem for most HOAs. So I want to thank you for that. We went through the Q&A session, so we're good there. And so I'd like to thank every one of you for attending today. I want to thank all the ECHO members for coming today and supporting our ongoing ECHO webinars. For those of you who are not ECHO members, please consider becoming a member and supporting HOA boards throughout the country. To join, simply go to www.echo-ca.org and click on the membership tab. For ECHO members, thank you for supporting us and for coming today. Please invite your friends and boards, and especially management firms and vendors, to join ECHO. A simple invitation is often all it takes to increase membership and get somebody to join. For the attorneys that were on the call today, I want to say thank you for all of you coming today and listening into Jean's presentation. We are going to be doing our presentations for the year. So if you're interested in joining the faculty this year or writing an article, please reach out to me. If you would like more information, that is, if everyone would like more information to get involved with ECHO, we have a few opportunities for you. Please refer to the slide and you'll see a few things that we're looking to fill, or you can just send me a note, dzapponi@echo-ca.org, and we can talk. So we have a few announcements for you. This year, ECHO is launching a new educational program focused on HOA board preparedness. The core curriculum is 10 courses, is designed for high quality training and is available for HOA board members interested, homeowners, and professionals. Your participation in this program will earn you a certificate of HOA board member preparedness. So the class and the coursework is going to be designed to cover all of the basics of becoming a board member. This is good for our vendors who are interested, as well as new board members and those interested in becoming board members. The courses will initially be offered live via webinar, and 8 of the 10 courses will be recorded. If you miss the live program, you'll be able to study online and take the course online. We do have tests of competency. They're not going to be tough tests, but we do have tests to make sure that people are participating and learning. If you or someone you know would like to enroll in the certificate program, please contact Connor and he'll set you up. His email address is on the screen. Our 2024 resource panels are just around the corner. We will be starting the year off with the Wine Country Resource Panel on February 20th from 11:30 until 1:30 p.m. at the new Vintage Community Center in Santa Rosa. We will be discussing how to fireproof an HOA, and it's a good conversation for up there. We also have the North Bay Resource Panel meeting in Novato. It will be on Tuesday, February 20th, and the new San Francisco Resource Panel will meet in the city for a wine tasting conversation about HOAs, and you're all invited to that. There are a limited number of seats, so please reach out and sign up. You can go to our website and get all the information, sign up from there. That meeting, the wine tasting, is going to be on February 21st from 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. As for our other webinars of this year, we have about 30 of them in the next month. Please plan on many of these. We have the February 1st, an educational workshop on good governance, elections, voting, and candidacy. On February 15th, we have a community conversation, good news, bad news, HOA board communication strategies. This is very important, especially as assessments have been going up, especially insurance, to communicate to the communities. And then on March 9th, we have an Ask the Attorney about the Davis-Sterling Act, and usually Jean's participates in that, and a couple others attorneys. So this is a good place to find an attorney and to learn about the various chapters in the Davis-Sterling Act that affect HOAs. That's part of our workshop and certification program. On December 27th and 28th, we have an educational workshop on board ethics. It's a two-part series, and it's that's also a member of the credentialing program. 3 of the courses are part of the ECHO HOA University Board Preparedness Program. A special note now to note is that ECHO will hold its 3rd annual Ask the Attorney About Insurance webinar on Wednesday, May 22nd. If you're having issues with insurance, I suggest you participate in this webinar. It's we'll have many insurance companies there to answer your questions and help explain why insurance is being denied and why the prices are going up so much. This is a huge issue, a hot issue. We know how much of a pain insurance is causing our HOAs. This year, the program will help explain situations and perhaps give you some answers. Please mark your calendars, May 22nd, 1 to 3 p.m. ECHO is planning 3 larger events this year. These are called educational seminars. We are planning 2 in the Bay Area, 1 in Southern California. There will be more information forthcoming as soon as we line up our venues. And once again, thank you to all of our sponsors for making this community conversation possible. And thank you to Jean for developing and presenting the material. We very much appreciate that. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending today and making this a successful event. ECHO appreciates your investment in education to foster a better quality of life in HOA communities.